Last week we looked at the first 4 chapters in the book of Ruth. Well, actually, the first of 4 chapters in the book of Ruth. There's only 4 chapters. And Ruth is a book that tells us a story. And because it tells us a story, instead of us telling us what to do or how we should think about any particular topic, it's kind of easy to pass over sometimes. But as we discussed last week, there's a reason that this little, largely domestic story is sandwiched between the epic tales of how God ruled Israel through the judges and how God ruled through human kings. And there's probably a lot of reasons, but one of the main ones that I see is that it reminds us that the God who moves nations is also the God of the individual who sees us, who, as Psalms reminds us, collects our tears in a bottle. So last week, we concentrated on Naomi's story in the first chapter and how that story relates to us personally by revealing God's care and plans for us, even in those times where we don't do everything right, and even when we feel like we're in a losing battle and everything is against us. This week, I want to shift gears so that we can look at why this story is essential in another way. And that's because it connects to how we understand the rest of the Bible all the way through to Jesus. So let's dive in. Okay, last week we ended where Naomi and Ruth, Naomi's daughter-in-law, had left Moab and made their way back to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. They were tired, they were grieving, and they were out of options. But they were also returning to Naomi's home, to her people. And we're going to start with Ruth 2, 1-2. Now Naomi had a kinsman on her husband's side, a prominent rich man of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain behind someone in whose sight I may find favor." She said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she went. Now, right up front, we're given the essential detail that Naomi had a kinsman on her husband's side. And this kinsman, Boaz, was prominent and rich, a man of wealth. But for early readers, this expression would mean more than he simply had money. It also carries the meaning of valor and substance and integrity and influence in the community. And he's related to Naomi's husband who had died years earlier. He's called her kinsman, and this is essential information. Now, the way they understood families in the Old Testament is a little different from the way we think of them. For the Hebrews, the family is whoever shares a bloodline, so think very extended. And on top of that, family groups are closely tied to the land. When God delivered Israel out of Egypt, God made a covenant with the people, an agreement that they willingly entered. And that agreement was that they would be God's people, the ones God would use to demonstrate his goodness to the world. And part of that covenant was the promise that God made to bring them to the promised land. And because of this, the land of the Israelites was never to be understood as owned by the individuals of a nation. That land is God's land. And the stewardship of the land is spread throughout the family groups in the 12 tribes. This means that even if someone became too poor to make use of the land, they couldn't sell the land to another person in the way that we understand buying and selling. They could lease the land to another family, but then at the year of Jubilee, which takes place every 50 years, ownership of that land would revert to the original family, ensuring that the land was always linked to the family that God had provided it for. That's an incredible system, isn't it? So Naomi, even though her husband had left and taken her with him to Moab decades prior when the story begins, still had ties to the land of her husband's family. And this is important if we want to understand what's happening in the rest of this book. Also in these first 2 verses, we're told that Ruth asks Naomi's permission to glean from the fields, hoping to find the favor of a stranger. And that was a cultural practice at that time. In Leviticus, God commanded the farmers and landowners who harvested to leave some grain behind for the poor, the widows or the orphans or the foreigners. Deuteronomy also mentions the practice, but specifies that the farmers weren't to harvest right up to the edges of their field. They should leave some purposely for those who have no other way to feed themselves. So Ruth asks Naomi for permission to join the others who were impoverished so she can work in the only way that was available to them. And our author refers to her here as Ruth the Moabite because we're to remember that she is an alien in a foreign land who is willing to work in an unfamiliar environment. We can also see that she's motivated, and by this request, we can see that even though she has faced the death of her husband and had to deal with her status as a foreigner, she's determined to accomplish whatever task is available to her. So she's industrious. And gleaning wasn't easy. Just like in our day and age, the rules and protections intended for people the rules that are intended to protect people don't always work, right? They don't always work because they still rely on other people treating each other well. The people who were harvesting the crops didn't always treat those who were gleaning with respect and dignity and generosity. In this case, Ruth knows that she's at a significant disadvantage because as someone who seeks to glean, she is not only at their mercy, but she's a foreigner without the protection of a husband. Naomi gives her permission though, so she goes. Ruth 2:3-4 reads, "She came and gleaned in the field behind the reapers. As it happened, she came to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Just then Boaz came from Bethlehem. He said to the reapers, 'The Lord be with you.' They answered, 'The Lord bless you.'" Just a side note about the phrase that the author added, "as it happened." It's here for a reason. As readers, this is supposed to make us pause and think about what's going on because Orthodox Jews don't believe in chance. Proverbs 16:33 states, "The lot is cast into the lap, but the decision is the Lord's alone." So the author is giving us a bit of an ironic twist that should make us ask questions about everything that's happened so far. As readers, we have a decision to make. Are we going to approach the story as one that demonstrates that God's hand is at work in every single detail? Or are we going to call everything that takes place a result of chance? And here's the fun part. As modern Christian readers, as people who do our best to walk with God every day, we know that from Ruth's perspective, this might feel like a chance encounter, just like the details of our lives do. But we know there's something more going on in the background, which makes us pause to consider what more might be going on in the background of our own lives. Isn't that fun how God works like that? So who did you meet this last week? And that encounter... No, it's okay. And that encounter, who did you meet this last week? And that encounter brought God's kingdom a little bit closer. Or what opportunity did you say yes to that will change the life of someone that you've never even met yet? Those three little words, "as it happened," have the power to change the way we see everything if we let them. But continuing on with Ruth 2:5-7, then Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, "To whom does this young woman belong?" The servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the Moabite who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers." So she came, and she has been on her feet from early morning until now without resting even for a moment. So because of the testimonies of the workers of the field, Boaz is told of her work ethic. Ruth 2:8-13 tells us, "Then Boaz said to Ruth, 'Now listen, my daughter, do not go glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Keep your eyes on the field that is being reaped and follow behind them. I have ordered the young men not to bother you. If you get thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn." Then she fell prostrate with her face to the ground and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your sight that you should take notice of me when I am a foreigner?" But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told me, and how you left your father and mother in your native land and came to people that you did not know before. May the Lord reward you for your deeds, and may you have full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." Then she said, "May I continue to find favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoke kindly to your servant, even though I am not one of your servants." So we get to see Boaz's character demonstrated right away. And this will continue. He invites her to join him during the mealtime, and then he tells the men to allow her to glean from the sheaves that are still standing to give her, and then to give her more on top of that. Not only that, one of my favorite details here is when Boaz points out her hardships and her sacrifices. He sees her. And then he adds the blessing, "May the Lord reward you for your deeds." But if we go back a couple of verses, we realize that Boaz is acting as the agent of that blessing. Sometimes we need to be reminded that when we're faced with the widow and the orphan and the foreigner, that we are called to be that agent of blessing for that person. And this is a little rough, but frankly, it's a pretty shallow prayer for us to pray that God blesses somebody and then turn around and hope God uses somebody else to do it. Everybody take a breath. So moving on with the story, though, when Ruth arrived home at the end of the day, Naomi asked her whose field she had found favor in, because the amount that she had brought home was beyond what they could have ever hoped to glean. Experts estimate that the amount of grain that she brought home was between 30 and 50 pounds. I don't know if any of you have ever lifted a 50-pound bag of flour. It's not a cakewalk. Flour cake. Ouch. Ruth, of course, tells her, and then we get to read Naomi's reaction in Ruth 2 verse 20. Then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "Blessed be he by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "That the man is a relative of ours, our nearest kin." After this, Naomi instructs Ruth to stay in Boaz's field because she'll be safe there. Some time goes by like this, and we aren't told how long, but it's probably about 3 weeks. But chapter 3 begins with Naomi looking toward the future. Ruth 3, 1-5 reads, Naomi, her mother-in-law said to her, "My daughter, I need to seek some security for you, so that it may be well with you. Now here is our kinsman Boaz, with whose young women you have been working. See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Now wash and anoint yourself and put on your best clothes and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." She said to her, "All that you tell me I will do." Now, let's just be honest, that sounds really strange to us. But in this culture, it wasn't. In fact, some of the misunderstanding has to do with the way we've chosen to see this passage and translate it through the years based on our culture more than theirs. Here, Naomi is instructing Ruth to wash, to put on perfume, and to dress. And our translation says that she should put on her best clothes, but the word best here is an addition. Instead, the garment that she's instructed to put on is more like a cloak that would have kept her warm. In short, this isn't a picture of Ruth trying to attract Boaz in the sense of making herself beautiful. Instead, this action is a conservative but bold step that was probably signaling that her mourning for her husband was over and she was now looking toward the future. That being said, when Ruth does as Naomi asks, it's not without risks. There are multiple areas where Ruth's intentions could have been misinterpreted and would make her look bad or open the door for Boaz to be revealed as less of a protector than they were hoping for. But Boaz wakes and finds Ruth at his feet, and their conversation is recorded in Ruth 3, 9-13. He said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your cloak over your servant, for you are next of kin." He said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. This last instance of your loyalty is better than the first. You have not gone after young men, whether rich or poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not be afraid. I will do for you all that you ask, for all the assembly of my people know that you are a worthy woman. But now, though it is true that I am a near kinsman, there is another kinsman more closely related than I. Remain this night, and in the morning, if he will act as next of kin for you, good, let him do it. If he is not willing to act as next of kin for you, then, as the Lord lives, I will act as next of kin for you. Lie down until morning." So we know by his response that Ruth is safe. Her intentions weren't misinterpreted, and Boaz didn't take advantage of the situation. But I want to look at the beginning of that passage to the way she answers his question, because it's interesting. She introduces herself as Ruth, not the Moabitess, not the widow, not the one who returned with Naomi, just Ruth, your servant. And she asks him to spread his cloak over her because he's her next of kin. This sentence is incredible because it calls into memory that God is the one who protects by spreading out his wings. He brought them out of Egypt on eagle's wings. Also, the request is an idiom for marriage, but like a lot of Hebrew expressions, it could also be understood as a practical request to be covered from the chill of the night. She's covering all her bases with just this little sentence. But Boaz gets it. He knows she's requesting that he marry her and serve as her kinsman redeemer. She's a foreign servant woman who's demanding that her boss marry her. There is so much risk here in this demand, but it's a risk based on her loyalty and kindness on behalf of her deceased husband's family, and Boaz sees this. Now, the kinsman redeemer is something that we're not real familiar with. But in this time and place, when a man would die, the closest kin, often the man's brother, would marry his widow. And here's where land and family names come into play. If someone were to redeem the widow of a near relative, this allowed for the land to stay in that family's name, in that original man's name. And a child born to the widow and the person who redeems her would be understood as carrying the family line of the husband who had died. The incredible thing is that Ruth could have stayed with her family back in Moab. She could have forgotten Naomi and returned to her people to begin life again, but she didn't. She traveled with Naomi back to her people with the expectation of having no way to redeem what had been lost when her husband died. And now, through her loyalty and kindness, they've found a kinsman redeemer. Sometimes it's easy to simply pass Ruth off as a good woman who was loyal and had a nice story where everything worked out in the end. But Ruth is the selfless foreigner who will make it possible for Naomi's family line to continue with the help of Boaz, who will also sacrifice so that their line doesn't disappear. The next morning, Boaz does as he stated. He meets with the kinsman who's a closer relative and offers him the opportunity to redeem the land of Naomi's husband. But when this other man finds out that he's going to have to redeem Ruth too, he decides to step back so that Boaz may act as the kinsman redeemer. And so he does. So Boaz does. And we read in Ruth 4, 13-17, "So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When they came together, the Lord made her conceive, and she bore a son. Then the woman said to Naomi, said to Naomi, remember Naomi was our first character in the first chapter. Then the women said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without next of kin, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has borne him. Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her bosom and became his nurse. The women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed. He became the father of Jesse, the father of David. So there is so much in this story to pull apart that I feel like I could have easily spent a few weeks on it. But we're in a very long sermon series, and we're trying to get through in less than 22 years. But this morning I just want to point out a couple things. First, building on last week, we see how God uses the ordinary person, someone with faith and kindness and bravery, to accomplish extraordinary things. And these extraordinary things are works of redemption in the small pictures of our lives, as well in the bigger picture that we can't see. Second, we can see that God uses Naomi's and Ruth's hardships to push them forward toward a redemption story that they could have never imagined. But at the same time, God also used to push humanity toward the promised redemption of this all. See how this is all working together? The book ends with a genealogy, and in this we see that it's this child, Obed, the child of a foreigner and a kinsman redeemer, who was the grandson of Rahab the prostitute that we read in Joshua, and this child would be the father of King David. And now we see the irony in the statement about chance bringing Ruth to Boaz's field. None of that was chance. It was all part of God's plan. Every piece that dropped into place through hardships and trials was used to stand as part of the line that would bring King David and eventually Jesus, our final Redeemer. But now I want to take a step back, because the reason we started this entire sermon series is so that we can better understand our own place in this huge story, and so that we can better explain how all of this points to Jesus, to somebody who grew up in a secular society and who has no idea what it means when we say that we should be saved from our sins. One of the reasons that this tiny book sandwiched between the epic stories is so important is because it gives us a picture of who our Messiah will be, how he will act, and what he'll value. And it makes him familiar to us. There are 85 verses in this book. 23 of them mention redeemed or redeemer. In Boaz, we have one of our first pictures of Jesus, our kinsman redeemer, a man of kindness and goodness and sacrifice, a provider, a healer, the one who would call us out to be a member of his family, the one who pays the debt that we couldn't pay, and who would bear our pain and our suffering to redeem it, turning it to good. There's something else that I want to point out with this story, though. We are meant to understand this book as a turning point in the Bible, as the shifting from the brutal world of the judges to the era where Israel would try to thrive under the leadership of a human king. But as I was reading this book, another thing occurred to me. This is also the place where we see flesh put onto the idea of redemption. The concept of redemption, the concept of something that was lost being found and purchased with a price, pops up in other areas before now. We see God delivering them and redeeming the people out of Egypt, right? We see a picture of redemption with Abraham and Isaac on the mountain. But this is when we see what it looks like in the flesh. This is where we see it played out in relationship. This is where we see it take human form. It's also where we see that redemption requires our response. The children of Israel were delivered out of Egypt, and they were redeemed when they stood at the base of the mountain and entered in the covenant relationship with God. Here I think we see deliverance take place when Naomi and Ruth are given access to food. That's one of the places. But redemption happens when Ruth lies at Boaz's feet and asks him to redeem their family. A couple of weeks ago, I brought up how it's so easy and tempting for us to stop making changes in our lives when the pain of our past decisions fade instead of when we're completely free, right? I think we could also consider this in terms on how often we're satisfied with deliverance when God wants to be our Redeemer. How often do we thank God when the miracle takes place, but God is still waiting for us to take that step into a real relationship with Him, where we bring all of the nothing we have, where we approach the throne with only our boldness and our brokenness, and we ask for God to redeem it. I guess this morning I'm asking if God is your deliverer, or if you've kneeled at His feet and asked God to be your Redeemer. I'm not talking about salvation here. That can wrap into it too. But I'm talking about the fact that sometimes the hardships in life make us lose sight of the fact that our God is here for more than fire insurance, self-help, and medicine. God wants a relationship with you so that you and everything around you can be redeemed. Sometimes when life gets hard, we have a tendency to box God in as our source of deliverance, and we want to keep Him there until we're free. But if we come to Him empty like Ruth, asking Him to redeem us, then something shifts. Suddenly, instead of seeing things only in terms of how they affect our lives, we begin to see things in terms of their effect on God's kingdom. Suddenly, instead of wanting things for ourselves, we want to see God's name lifted high. And when that happens, then we're able to look past the immediate, because our faith tells us that God's goodness will be seen in whatever the situation is. And we know that God will sustain us until His work is done. You see, there is deliverance. There is the point in time when God provides for us, and that's incredible. But that's only the beginning, because when you look at the miracle and allow it to do what it should, call us closer to God, and we respond and step out in faith and accept the truth that what happens to us is not just for us, then we have an additional weapon in our arsenal. Satan has no power against someone who stands redeemed. Satan has no power against someone who even in trial says, God, if this trial is to glorify your name, then I'm okay with it. When we sit at Jesus' feet boldly saying, you are my kinsman redeemer, Satan has no power over us. So even if you've knelt at the altar 1,000 times, and even if you ask God into your heart every Sunday as a kid, when we take communion together this morning, I'm hoping that you take a moment to question whether or not you need to reacquaint yourself with the God who does more than heals, the God who does more than provides, the God who does more than delivers, because we are serving the God who redeems. And because of that, we are free. So this morning as a church, we kneel at the cross and ask God to cover us with His cloak, with His blood, to redeem us. Because when we truly accept that God has purchased our pain and our hurt with the work of the cross, then I think we kneel there and say, if you want all this nothing, then here it is. It's yours to turn into something. So worship team, if you want to come up. Dad, if you want to come up. So this morning we're going to take communion together. And you can all stand if you can. When we do take communion, I often like to point out that we take communion for two reasons. First, to remember the sacrifice that Jesus made on the cross to uphold our end of the covenant, to stand in our place and to redeem us. And second, to take communion and remember that we're part of God's family, the worldwide community of believers whose purpose has been rewritten and who live to reflect God's image to the rest of the world. But this morning, I want us to think about it in a different way. We're going to walk up here to get the elements. And when we do, I want us to think about that journey as if we're Ruth, putting on our cloak, by faith having the security, having left the security of the known, and getting ready to ask our kinsman redeemer, Jesus, to cover us and to redeem us.